The Tyranids should have been called the Macraggids, or the Prandians. The name we know them by only exists because one planet had the misfortune of being first. The original Battle of Macragge video covered the event, Marneus Augustus Calgar and the Ultramarines holding the line against Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first company annihilated to the last man in the polar fortresses, the fleet broken in the void. That video told you what happened. What it left on the table were the questions underneath the event. Why does this species carry the name it does? How did that name almost become something else? The Second War received approximately one sentence of coverage, which was an insult the comment section noted with precision. And what does the Hivemind actually do when it consumes something that isn't supposed to have a physical form? 3 gaps, 3 different shapes. This video addresses them starting with the name, because the name is where the horror of contingency lives. In 745 M41, Tyran Primus was an ocean world in the Ultima Segmentum. What it was before that year was an Adeptus Mechanicus research installation, relatively well defended for an oceanic outpost at the edge of known space, operating in the category of worlds the Mechanicus maintained for long-term observational and extraction purposes. Not a fortress world, not a billion-soldier garrison. Researchers, engineers, and the kind of layered defenses appropriate against conventional threats. The conventional threat model was what failed them. Hive Fleet Behemoth's approach vector cut through the Ultima Segmentum toward the galactic core. Tyran Primus was in the path. In-universe accounts of what later expeditions found in that system describe a planet unrecognizable as the world it had been. Not damaged, not bombed, not irradiated in ways that left the geological record intact. Consumed. Every ocean drained. Every microorganism in the water column gone. Every organic structure on the surface reduced to nothing the chemistry of biology would recognize as matter. The fleet didn't attack Tyran Primus in any conventional military sense. It processed the planet. Tyran Primus wasn't defeated, it was digested. Somewhere in the interval between first contact and complete consumption, transmissions left the planet. Those transmissions are the reason any record of the encounter exists. The researchers on Tyran Primus were looking at something Imperial xenobiology had no prior catalog entry for, no comparison case. Whatever terminology they used in those first hours to describe what they were observing, that wording didn't survive. What survived was the planet's name. The mechanism is naming by contact point, the standard Imperial practice when encountering a species with no prior designation. Derive the working classification from the context of first confirmed contact. The encounter at Tyran gave a name to this deadly new threat to all life in the galaxy, a terrifying xeno-species known as the Tyranids forever after. The derivation is direct. The planet's name, the solar system's designation, and the species name collapse into one. Tyran, Tyranids. The link is present in every tier of Imperial record. One clarification worth making. The previous video used the spelling Tyran and rendered it without completing the linguistic link between the planet name and the species name. Tyran reflects an older transliteration found in certain early publications, carried forward through community transcription. The settled canonical spelling is Tyran, Tyran Primus. That correction matters because once you see the mechanism clearly, contact point becomes species name, the contingency of it becomes the actual horror. The Behemoth drove through the Ultima Segmentum on a single concentrated vector. Tyran Primus was in the path first. Macragge, homeworld of the Ultramarines, was in the path next. Behemoth reached it after Tyran Primus, not before. Now remove Tyran Primus from the equation. Shift the fleet's entry vector by a degree or two of galactic navigation. The first Adeptus Mechanicus installation in Behemoth's path is some other outpost, not the one in the Tyran system. The fleet continues, same scale, same biological horror. It reaches the next world in the Ultima Segmentum. If that world is Macragge, the fortress monastery of the Ultramarines, the homeworld of one of the most decorated Space Marine chapters in the Imperium. Then the first confirmed transmission describing an entirely new species comes from Macragge. The Mechanicus files the initial report. The Inquisition formalizes the classification. Every codex ever written, every Death World designation ever filed, every last transmission from a planet being consumed uses the name derived from that first contact. Marneus Augustus Calgar would spend the rest of his career fighting creatures named after his own homeworld. Every Ordo Xenos file would open with the designation Macraggids. The chapter master of the Ultramarines would hold the distinction of having both defended his homeworld and given the galaxy's most dangerous species its permanent name in the same campaign. The polar fortresses of Macragge, already the site of the First Company's annihilation, would carry the additional weight of being the etymological origin of the species that had done it. Instead, an ocean world research station with no surviving named personnel absorbed that weight, and the name from its destruction became permanent. Prandium presents a slightly different version of the same argument. Prandium was an imperial world in the Ultima Segmentum, consumed in 993 M41. Canonical Dead World records confirm it. But Prandium fell in the Second Tyrannic War to Hive Fleet Kraken, nearly 250 years after the species was already named. It was never a candidate for the original designation. The counterfactual works only in the hypothetical, where Prandium was first contact rather than Tyran Primus. The point isn't to identify which alternative name is most credible. The point is that the name is entirely contingent on factors that had nothing to do with the species itself. Approach vectors, orbital mechanics, which specific Adeptus Mechanicus outpost happened to occupy which set of stellar coordinates. The greatest existential threat in the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy carries the name it does because an ocean world was positioned at a particular location in 745.m41. The contingency may run deeper than geography. Imperial archives contain fragmented references to an earlier encounter, a designation, the Legion of Ouroboros, associated with a hive fleet that reportedly entered the galaxy before Behemoth. The suggestion embedded in those fragments is that the Imperium encountered something and then lost the record, that the institutional memory of a prior first contact was erased along with whatever installation made it. Those records are treated as rumored rather than confirmed, even within the lore, which matters. But if they are accurate, then the naming history gains another dimension. Tyranids isn't just the product of geography, it's the product of which encounter survived as legible evidence. Tyran Primus lasted long enough for a transmission to escape. Whatever world first encountered the Ouroboros fleet didn't. The name we use may not be from the first encounter. It may be from the first encounter anyone remembered. On the formal question of who assigned the designation, the Adeptus Mechanicus was operating Tyran Primus and would have filed the initial encounter reports. Inquisitor Fidus Cryptman is confirmed in canonical sources as the first to formally recognize the Tyranid threat to the galaxy, which suggests the Inquisition ratified the classification rather than originating it. The most likely reconstruction is that the name arose from the encounter, was recorded by the Mechanicus, and was formally recognized through the Inquisition. The exact administrative moment, the signed decree that made Tyranids permanent across all imperial records, isn't directly reproduced in any surviving canonical text. The derivation is certain. The bureaucratic chain isn't fully documented. What is certain is this: the researchers on Tyran Primus didn't know what they were looking at. They had no prior encounter in the institutional record to compare it to. They watched something arrive that consumed an ocean, filed what they could, and then the transmission stopped. The planet's name outlived the ocean, the station, the engineers who staffed it, and the world itself. The species named from that destruction has since consumed thousands of worlds. The name of the galaxy's greatest existential threat is an administrative artifact from a station that no longer exists, filed by personnel whose individual names appear in no surviving record. The middle child of the Tyrannic Wars deserves more than one sentence. Hive Fleet Behemoth got a full video. Hive Fleet Leviathan gets cited whenever someone needs to explain exterminatus and the logic of biomass denial. Hive Fleet Kraken got filed between them and received proportionate coverage, almost none. This section is the correction. Hive Fleet Kraken's invasion began in 990 M41, approximately 245 to 250 years after Behemoth's defeat at Macragge. The Imperium spent those 250 years knowing the Tyranids existed, knowing the scale of damage a single fleet could inflict, updating doctrine and rebuilding defenses around the tactical model demonstrated at Macragge. The assumption embedded in that rebuilt doctrine, the assumption survival at Macragge had validated, was that the threat model was understood. Hive Fleet Behemoth had been a single concentrated charge, one approach vector, one front, one throat at which to concentrate maximum Imperial force. At Macragge, that model barely worked. It cost the Ultramarines their entire first company. It required simultaneous void battle and ground defense that ground the greatest Space Marine chapter in the Imperium to near breaking point. But it worked. A massed force meeting a single concentrated push could, at sufficient cost, break the fleet. Kraken arrived and invalidated the assumption entirely. Hive Fleet Kraken's defining tactical characteristic was simultaneous assault across many human-settled planets at once, executed through a series of smaller, separate forces advancing on multiple vectors at the same time. Not one direction, many directions, simultaneously activated across a front wider than Behemoth had ever covered. The Imperial strategic problem this created was structural, not tactical. Concentrating forces on one front left every other front undefended. Distributing forces across all fronts meant no single engagement had the combat mass to be decisive. Kraken had specifically removed the one response option that had worked against the previous fleet. The strategic implications extended beyond the physical assault. The shadow in the warp is the product of constant two-way psychic communication between the Hivemind and every lesser organism in the fleet. A signal so dense it disrupts warp translation in surrounding space, degrades astropathic communication, and cuts off Imperial forces from one another at precisely the moment coordination is most critical. Behemoth had imposed that blackout across a single front. The Ultramarines at Macragge had operated in a psychic shadow, but it was a shadow with defined edges, a coherent zone around a coherent fleet. Kraken's simultaneous multi-vector assault expanded the shadow in the warp across an exponentially larger area of space almost overnight. Every new tendril that landed brought its own shadow with it. Each tendril's shadow merged with adjacent tendrils' shadows. The Imperium wasn't just fighting on more fronts, it was fighting blind across all of them simultaneously, with astropathic communication degraded across a region so large that coordinating a response on one front meant operating without reliable information about any other. The material cost wasn't abstract. The Second Tyrannic War resulted in the confirmed loss of thousands of Imperial worlds across the 990 to 993 M41 campaign. Thousands. Prandium was among them, consumed in 993 M41, an Imperial world scraped to nothing the same way Tyran Primus had been scraped 248 years earlier. Prandium's destruction gets a line in the records. The people who lived there don't get a name. The Lamenter's Space Marine chapter held off Tyranid warriors during one of Kraken's planetary assaults and maintained that line until the last evacuation starship had been loaded. The entire canonical record of this action is that single documented fact. They held until everyone else was out. The chapter subsequently suffered heavily. What that means for a Space Marine chapter against Tyranid numbers is a chain of attrition. Casualties exceeding reinforcement rate, company strength degrading below combat effectiveness, Marines being spent to hold lines rather than to win engagements. The Lamenters held a line they couldn't hold indefinitely, and they held it long enough. The record of how long the action took and what the evacuation involved isn't preserved in available canonical sources. Just the fact that they did it and what it cost them. Ultramarines forces committed to the Second Tyrannic War response included the battle barge Octavius, which deployed drop pods above the world-designated Icar 4. Icar 4 would become one of the two decisive engagements that broke Kraken's primary assault, alongside the Battle of Iyanden. But before those two victories resolved the war, the campaign's most viscerally documented engagement took place at a target the Tyranids had never reached before, a target that wasn't an Imperial world at all. Craftworld Iyanden. In 993 M41, a Kraken tendril turned toward the Eldar craftworld of Iyanden, one of the largest surviving Asuryani population centers still in existence. The craftworld situation at the moment of contact was shaped by the shadow and the warp before a single organism had landed. Iyanden was isolated, cut off from contact with every other Eldar fleet and every potential response, for over a solar week by the psychic interference of the approaching fleet. A solar week of total communication blackout, no warp translation possible in or out of the surrounding region, while the craftworld's defenders absorbed two massive assault waves in rapid succession. To understand what two assault waves in rapid succession meant for Iyanden, the population context is necessary. The Imperium loses millions in a single morning of a major offensive and regenerates the demographic loss within a generation. The birth rate absorbs the attrition. The Asuryani don't work that way. The Eldar population was already catastrophically reduced before the Tyranids ever entered the galaxy. Their civilization-ending catastrophe predates the Tyrannic Wars by 10,000 years. Iyanden's total population, by the time Kraken reached it, was a fraction of what it had been at the height of the Eldar Empire. Every Eldar warrior who died in the first assault wave was a loss that Iyanden couldn't replace on any human demographic timeline. By the time the second wave hit, the craftworld was defending with numbers it genuinely couldn't afford to spend. The survivors weren't holding a line so much as occupying a space where a line had been. The bone-white corridors of Iyanden's interior. A craftworld isn't a ship in any conventional sense, but a vast living structure carrying the wraithbone remains of the Eldar dead alongside the living, the two populations coexisting in a physical and spiritual continuum, were being fought over room by room against organisms that don't exhaust, don't feel the psychological weight of attrition, and are directed by a coordinating intelligence that registers casualties as acceptable resource expenditure rather than loss. The Eldar defending Iyanden were fighting that calculus with a population they couldn't replenish. What turned the engagement was Iriel. Prince Iriel, an Asuryani operating with a separate fleet when the shadow descended, broke through Kraken's orbital blockade, commanding combined Eldar space fleets. He didn't arrive because the craftworld summoned him. Communication through the shadow and the warp was impossible. He came because the shadow itself was visible from outside. A darkness in the warp that any sufficiently sensitive navigator could identify as Iyanden's coordinates going silent. Iriel interpreted that silence as a direction. On the surface of the craftworld, during the peak of the second assault, Iriel located the Hive Tyrant commanding the ground engagement and killed it in single combat. That specific act requires context to understand why it constituted a tactical turning point. A Hive Tyrant isn't simply a powerful bioform, it's a synapse organism, a psychic relay node that maintains real-time coordination between the Hivemind's intelligence and every lesser organism within its operational radius. Gaunts, gargoyles, hormagaunts, the swarming biological components of a Tyranid assault. They are directed entities, not autonomous ones. The Hivemind's tactical intelligence is relayed through synapse organisms in a hierarchy, and the Hive Tyrant is the highest tier of that relay structure in a localized engagement. When a Hive Tyrant dies mid-assault, the psychic coherence of everything in its operational radius breaks down. Lesser organisms that were acting as coordinated components of a unified tactical intelligence become individually directed. The assault doesn't stop. The organisms are still present, still hostile, still physically capable of killing. but they lose the Hivemind's real-time coordination. They scatter according to base biological imperatives rather than tactical direction. At Iyanden, at the exact moment Iriel destroyed the Hive Tyrant, the wave pressing the Eldar defenders inward through coordinated multi-front pressure became, in psychic terms, uncoordinated. That was the pivot. The Eldar defenders, who had been fighting a directed intelligence with bodies they couldn't afford to spend, suddenly faced the same bodies operating on basic predatory instinct rather than tactical direction. It didn't make them harmless, it made them manageable. An exile fought back to a home that had cast him out. He broke a Tyranid orbital blockade with improvised fleet action, arrived on a craft world that was already losing, found the command node of the assault, and destroyed it. The Battle of Iyanden is a component engagement of the Second Tyrannic War, not a separate conflict, but one battle within a larger war. It demonstrates a Tyranid fleet threatening not just Imperial space, but one of the galaxy's other surviving major civilizations. It ends with a victory that cost Iyanden more of its irreplaceable population than it could absorb without permanent civilizational damage. It features exactly the kind of named character, specific action, documented outcome narrative that the broader Second Tyrannic War coverage almost never receives. The Second Tyrannic War ended in 993 M41 through the dual victories at Iyanden and Ikar IV, both in the same year, both required, neither sufficient alone. Kraken's primary fleet was broken. Breaking a Tyranid fleet isn't destroying it. Surviving organisms separated into independent splinter fleets, self-directing under local psychic architecture, continuing to consume worlds on independently chosen vectors after the main fleet's coherence collapsed. Splinter fleets from Hive Fleet Kraken were active after 993 M41. Some remain unaccounted for in canonical records. 5 years after Kraken's primary defeat, Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived to begin the Third Tyrannic War. 5 years. The Imperium had 5 years between the end of the Second War and the beginning of the Third, with Kraken splinters still active during the interval. The rhythm of the Tyrannic Wars at this point isn't a slow escalation. It's consecutive existential crises with barely a generation between them, and each successive fleet more expansive than the last. The asymmetric coverage between Hive Fleet Behemoth and Hive Fleet Kraken is a publication artifact, not a lore judgment. Behemoth was the original Codex threat. The Battle of Macragge was the introductory scenario in the Warhammer 40,000 starter box. When players first encountered the Tyranids as a faction, the canonical reference point was the First Tyrannic War. Behemoth, Macragge, Calgar, the polar fortresses. Behemoth became the default because it was first in print, not because the material record makes it the most significant fleet action in the Tyrannic Wars. Kraken's simultaneous multi-vector assault was tactically more sophisticated than Behemoth's frontal charge. It reached further, destroyed more worlds, expanded the shadow in the warp across a wider theater, and came within a single combat of eliminating one of the last surviving non-human civilizations in the galaxy. None of that displaced Behemoth from the spotlight, because the spotlight was built around a starter box already in print before Kraken was introduced. The middle child argument isn't sentimental. The ledger of the Second Tyrannic War documents more destruction, more tactical innovation, and a wider strategic footprint than the first. The coverage it has received does not reflect the ledger. One question from the original video deserves a clean 2-sentence answer. Why would the Imperium exterminate one of its own worlds just to stop the Tyranids from consuming it? Tyranid consumption is fuel. Every organic gram on a consumed world feeds the Hivemind's biomass pool, the direct manufacturing base for new organisms, new biomorphs, and fleet replenishment. Inquisitor Lord Fidus Cryptman, confirmed as the first to formally recognize the Tyranid threat to the galaxy, and a veteran of all 3 major Tyrannic wars, understood that arithmetic precisely. He ordered exterminatus on worlds in Hive Fleet Leviathan's advanced path specifically to deny that resource. Destroy the food before the fleet consumes it, and the fleet can't grow at its calculated rate. An empty world produces nothing. Cryptman also redirected Leviathan into orc-held space in the Octarius sector, engineering a conflict between two of the galaxy's most dangerous species as another expression of the same doctrine. The Inquisition eventually censured him for the scale of what he destroyed. The policy that emerged from his decisions carries the designation the Cryptman contingency, applied by Imperial forces beyond Cryptman's own orders in subsequent engagements. The strategic logic was internally consistent. Every world the Tyranids can't consume is fleet growth they don't achieve. The cost of that logic was measured in billions of Imperial lives destroyed to prevent billions more from being consumed. The harder question doesn't have a clean answer, the one about chaos. Here is what the canonical record does say and exactly where it stops. The Tyranids' relationship with the Warp is structurally unlike any other major faction in Warhammer 40,000. Tyranid organisms don't generate individual psychic presences in the Warp. They don't have souls in the sense that Warp mechanics require. What they generate instead is the shadow in the Warp, the constant two-way communication between the Hivemind and every organism in the fleet produces psychic interference so concentrated it suppresses the Warp in surrounding space. The fleet is a moving dead zone, a region where Warp-sensitive navigation becomes unreliable, where psychers suffer cognitive disruption, and where astropathic communication degrades towards silence. The Tyranids don't inhabit the Warp, they occlude it. That architecture matters for the chaos question because Warp entities, chaos demons specifically, aren't biological organisms in any conventional material plane sense. They are Warp energy given temporary physical form. They exist in the material plane only as long as the Warp sustains them. Remove the sustaining energy, and they don't decay, they dissolve. No lasting organic structure, no stable protein, no cellular architecture for the Hivemind to metabolize, no genetic blueprint to read. The canonical position on direct daemon encounters is that the Hivemind avoids them. It gets no biomass from them, only loses organisms in the attempt. Daemons aren't food. They are a resource drain with a zero-calorie yield, and the Hivemind's behavior reflects that calculation through avoidance. That answer covers direct daemon combat scenarios. What the question was actually asking about is different and harder. Chaos corruption doesn't require daemon combat to enter biological matter. Worlds that have sustained warp contamination, regions touched by warp storms over generations, populations that have undergone long-term mutation under chaos influence, carry warp taint in their physical biology. Their flesh exists as material substance. It bleeds. It has cellular structure. It has genetic content. A Chaos Space Marine's hyperdense corrupted anatomy is, physically, a biomass source in ways a daemon isn't. The Warp has rewritten the organism's genetic and structural blueprint, but the organism is still present in the material plane as an object with physical properties. It can be consumed. The Hivemind processes absorbed genetic material at a level of sophistication no imperial science has replicated. When it consumes an organism with a useful adaptation, denser armor plating, acid-producing glands, enhanced sensory architecture, that information enters the Hivemind's genetic library and becomes available for expression in subsequent biomorphs. This is the engine behind the Tyranids' accumulated biological diversity across millions of years of intergalactic predation. They eat planets, read the resulting genetic archive, and incorporate what they found valuable into the next production run. Chaos corruption is, at a biological level, the Warp imposing a different kind of information onto physical matter. Mutations under chaos influence aren't random developmental errors. They are the Warp rewriting an organism's blueprint according to a logic that does not originate in material physics. A chaos-corrupted creature isn't simply a damaged version of what it was. It's something that has been partially authored by a force that operates outside the material plane's causal rules. The question the lore hasn't answered is this: what happens when the Hivemind, a physical intelligence that occludes the Warp rather than interfacing with it, attempts to read a genetic blueprint that has been partially authored by the Warp. No canonical codex text, no Black Library novel available in the research base addresses this with specificity. There are confirmed encounters between Tyranid and Chaos forces across the Warhammer 40,000 setting. They have occupied the same theaters of war. They have fought, but the metabolic downstream of those encounters, what the Hivemind does with genetic data from chaos-corrupted biological material, isn't addressed in any available canonical source. Two possibilities emerge from the framework the lore does provide, and the lore does not foreclose either. The first, the Hivemind treats genetic input as data, readable, sortable, incorporable. Warp-authored mutations in that data might function as corrupted code, partially parsable, producing incoherent outputs when the Hivemind attempts to express them. The Hivemind consuming a heavily chaos-mutated organism, finding nothing workable in the resulting genetic noise, discarding the data. The chaos-corrupted biomass yields nothing usable, and the interaction has no meaningful biological consequence, just noise. The Hivemind moves on. The second possibility, Warp-authored mutations aren't simply noise. They carry genuine structural information from a different authorial logic, the logic of the Warp itself. The Hivemind processing that information does not simply discard it, it attempts to express it. What emerges reflects both source materials, not a pure Tyranid adaptation, not a pure chaos mutation, but a biomorph operating according to rules from both systems simultaneously. Something the Hivemind didn't design and the ruinous powers didn't intend. The lore does not describe this having happened. It also does not describe what the Hivemind does with information it has no prior template for processing. Because in any canonical text, the Hivemind has never reached the limits of its ability to process biological input. The Hivemind consuming chaos-tainted flesh is, canonically, an uncharted edge case. This is a genuine gap in the record, one that reads less like a deliberate lore mystery and more like a question the authors haven't yet been forced to address directly. The Tyranids and Chaos intersect in the setting, but those intersections have been handled at the tactical level rather than the metabolic one. The source material has consistently focused on what happens when they fight, not on what the Hivemind does with the bodies afterward. What is unambiguous is this: the Imperium doesn't have the answer either. The Adeptus Mechanicus has never had a controlled observation of what happens when the Hivemind processes chaos-tainted biomass. Every situation that might generate that data occurs in active combat on worlds being consumed, where the observers are dying before results can be recorded. The Inquisition's files on Tyranid biological processing are already decades behind what the Hivemind has demonstrated it can do in the field. If chaos-tainted biomass does something unusual when processed, if it generates synapse organisms with structural instabilities, produces biomorphs with adaptations that shouldn't exist in the material universe, or creates something that defies the Hivemind's own genetic logic, the Imperial scholar who might identify that outcome and file the report hasn't survived to do so. In the logic of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, that absence of information is itself accurate to what the Imperium actually is, an institution that has been fighting the Tyranids since 745 M41, that has endured 3 major tyrannic wars at catastrophic cost, whose most dedicated Tyranid specialist was eventually censured for the scale of his countermeasures, and which still hasn't answered basic metabolic questions about the enemy, because every situation that would generate those answers is fatal to the observer. The Hivemind is learning faster than the Imperium is. It has been consuming genetic information from planets across multiple galaxies for millions of years. The Imperium has been studying it for roughly 3 centuries. The gap between what the Hivemind knows and what the Imperium can document about the Hivemind does not close over time. It widens. 3 gaps, 3 different answers. The naming etymology has a clean answer that is also a horror story about contingency. The word Tyranids exists because a specific Adeptus Mechanicus research outpost on an ocean world in the Ultima Segmentum happened to occupy a particular set of stellar coordinates in 745.m41. A different approach vector, a different first contact point, and the species name changes in every codex ever written, every Death World designation ever filed, every last transmission from a planet being eaten. Tyran Primus wasn't chosen for any quality that distinguished it. It was adjacent. And if the fragmented records of an earlier encounter are accurate, that a prior contact existed before Tyran Primus, one the Imperium lost entirely, then the name we use isn't even from the first encounter. It's from the first encounter that survived as evidence. Hive Fleet Kraken has an answer that is a vindication and an accounting correction simultaneously. The simultaneous multi-front assault across thousands of Imperial worlds from 990 to 993 M41. The shadow in the warp expanded across a front broader than anything the First Tyrannic War had produced. Prandium consumed in 993 M41 and gone. Craftworld Iandan brought within a single combat of extinction. The Lamenters holding a line they couldn't hold indefinitely until the last ship cleared. Both Iandan and Ikar IV required in the same year to break the fleet's primary coherence. Kraken broken into splinter fleets that continued independently, some still unaccounted for, with the Third Tyrannic War beginning 5 years later before the Second War's aftermath had resolved. The original coverage this fleet received was one sentence for the most tactically sophisticated and geographically expansive Tyranid campaign in the canonical record. The chaos biomass question has a partial answer and an honest edge. Demons yield no biomass. The Hivemind avoids them. The logic is sound. Chaos-tainted biological matter in the conventional physical sense is a genuine open question. The theoretical framework the Lord does provide suggests either noise and discard or something more structurally complicated that neither side intended. The canonical sources haven't ruled in either direction. The Imperium doesn't have the answer. The observation posts that might have generated it didn't survive long enough to file a report. The original video told you what happened. These three things are what it implied and never said. Everything begins with Tyran Primus, the name, the designation, the taxonomic identity that every subsequent Imperial record about the galaxy's greatest existential threat derives from. That name exists because an ocean world was in the wrong place in 745 M41, because the researchers who observed the fleet's arrival transmitted what they could before the transmission stopped, and because the world's name was in their header information. The Tyranids didn't earn their name through their greatest battle. They earned it through the one no one survived to describe. Subscribe if you want more lore like this, the gaps, the contingencies, the things the official sources implied without ever completing.